there is more detail and a profile developing of kids who kill kids.
One of the things that happens in typical discussions about social problems is that the very way we talk about the problems tends to obscure some of the root causes. For example, violence is not typically talked about as a gender issue, but the fact is that one gender, men, perpetrate approximately 90% of the violence. Now, part of the reason for this is that because men are the dominant group, and one of the ways dominance functions is through being unexamined. This is true for other areas as well. For example, when we hear the word race in the United States, we tend to immediately think African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, etc. When we hear the term sexual orientation, we tend to think gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. When we hear the term gender, we tend to think women. In each case, the dominant group, white people, heterosexual people, men, don't get examined, as if men don't have a gender, as if white people don't belong to some racial grouping, as if heterosexual people don't have some sort of sexual orientation. In other words, we focus always on the subordinated group and not on the dominant group. And that's one of the ways that the power of dominant groups isn't questioned, by remaining invisible. There are a number of ways this happens. For example, the linguist Julia Penelope talks about how the use of the passive voice when we talk about crimes against women tends to shift our focus off of male perpetrators and onto female victims and survivors. For example, we talk about how many girls were raped last year, how many women were assaulted, or how many women were slain, as opposed to saying how many men raped women or girls, or how many boys or men assaulted and murdered women. Another way that we can see this idea about the invisibility of masculinity being played out is in the discussion about so-called youth violence. You read headlines in newspapers all around the country about this problem of kids killing kids.
But after 10 school shootings in 3 years, there is more detail and a profile developing of kids who kill kids.
But this isn't kids killing kids. Overwhelmingly, it's boys killing boys and boys killing girls. An example of the way the media degenders discussion of violence can be seen in the coverage of the Jonesboro, Arkansas massacre in the spring of 1998. There were all these headlines about kids killing kids and children killing children and what's going on with our kids, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, one article in the New York Times, a think piece that was a step-back piece to try to discuss the whole issue of all this range of school shootings, in one parentheses said, all of these shootings were done by boys, and then what was in the parentheses wasn't discussed in the rest of the article. So you have a whole article trying to pull together all the different factors that are causing these shootings, and the one most important, in my opinion, is in the parentheses and not discussed. Some people will say, well, it's obvious that boys are doing these shootings. It's the reason why we don't say it. The reason why we say it's kids killing kids. Everybody knows that boys are the ones doing the vast majority of the violence. You don't need to say it. But the fact is, if you don't say it, then in the subsequent discussion about the causes of the violence, then you're going to leave out one of the key elements. Another example, road rage. People don't typically think of road rage as a gendered phenomenon, but one recent study showed that out of 10,000 cases of aggressive driving or road rage, over 95% were males. But you read the editorials in the newspapers throughout the country about road rage in the articles and essays and opinion columns, and it's rarely talked about as a masculine or male phenomenon. It's just a phenomenon on our roadways. If women were doing it, 95% of the people who were doing it were women, you can bet that it would be the single issue that would be talked about is why are women, what is going on in the gender construction of women that caused them to act in that way. When girls commit violence, that's always the subject. The gendered nature of the crime is always part of the discussion.
A sensational case goes to trial in Virginia tomorrow involving a man who was sexually mutilated by his wife.
Now, Lorena Bobbitt, her crime was brutal, admittedly, and I understand, believe me, as a man, understand why people would be, especially men, would be very uncomfortable about that. But every day, men are murdering and mutilating women, and it doesn't cause as great a national outcry. One of the reasons why the film Thelma and Louise caused such a stir back in the early 90s was that women were the ones who were acting violently.
God. Oh, my God.
Get the car.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Louise, you shot him.
You have films all the time. I mean, go into any video store and walk down the aisles, you know, and look at all the films that feature violence against women, including sexualized violence against women by men. And there's little outcry and little commentary by the movie critics, for example, when they're reviewing these films. They don't talk about the fact that we have this huge epidemic of men assaulting women, and we're making yet another film about an assault against women. Look at the recent remake of Psycho. That was not part of the discussion when Psycho was re-released, that we're yet again going to show a sexualized image of a woman being assaulted, and that's going to be considered great art, and people are going to go see it. Yet Thelma and Louise, you had debates going on in the newspapers of the United States. Is this a bad trend? It was similar to the outcry about Lorena Bobbitt. What's happened is because violence has been gendered masculine, we think it's unusual only when women do it. When men do it, it's so normal that its masculine character is unremarkable. In fact, it's invisible. So one of the things we have to do is to make it visible. Feminist scholars and activists have been trying to do this for years, but they've been largely ignored. Making masculinity visible is the first step to understanding how it operates in the culture and how definitions of manhood have been linked to dominance and control.